Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. How are you guys doing today? Today, I wanted to talk about education. I wanted to talk about the new movement that has been going on in some countries, and mostly like Middle Eastern countries. I also wanted to talk about the importance of education and the etymology of education. Long story short, the reason why I want to talk about these things is because yesterday there was a post that sparked a debate of whether current education is important or not, whether college education is important or not. And um, the person who was doing the post basically was trying to prove that education as a whole is of no importance, that experience beats education. While I agree to some extent on those words, there is a reason why education is important, and there's a reason why um, you might find academics or people who are who are in academia, they will be up in arms when talking about education, especially higher education, because they did not do all of these research and all of those hours and hours and hours of being up all night to work on your dissertation or to work on how to just work on things. It's not as easy. So when this becomes dismissed, understandably, you're gonna take off a few people. If not most academia, they're gonna be ticked off because it's basically you've just dismissed hours upon hours upon hours of research, of reading, of going, of looking up things, and making sure that your hypothesis, whether it's correct or is it not correct. Did you actually do what your hypothesis said? Did you actually were you able to prove it, or were you? It's pleasantly surprised that some of these hypotheses was not like exactly what you thought about it. One of the examples is that when I did my thesis on stagnation of power, and I was looking at the stagnation of power under Hosni Mubarak, and my hypothesis was that there was stagnation. And definition of stagnation, basically there is not much movement of power, and by not much movement of power, like not much movement of like power within the country itself, whether that is like through education, through welfare, and just it stagnates, like you don't get any improvement in it. And I was pleasantly surprised that that was not completely correct. There was, yes, there were areas where there was stagnation, and there were areas that did not have stagnation. And then I had to actually look at the history of I had to go like all the way back to like the monarchies, and reading through the history and reading through if you want to love this country, if you really want to love Egypt, and if you want to at the same time get to make yourself miserable, just read the history. Just read how rich the history was, how things were back in the old days and nowadays, and just the changing of like the laws, the changing of like the status quo and things like that. It is fascinating. It is beyond fascinating. But then it goes back to one thing: education. It actually goes back to the education of the person who's in charge. What is their education? What is their loyalties? Where does the loyalties stand in? How do they seek education? And when I talk about education, I'm talking about academic education. I'm not talking about the certificates. I'm not talking about the professional certificates. I'm talking about academia. Because I'll talk the professional certificates. I'll talk about it later on. But here's how it was in Egypt, and why I tend to be very negative about this country is because at one point in time it was one of the best countries you could go to. It was top of the world, and people would travel throughout all of the world will come to Egypt to learn from Egypt, and the educational system in Egypt was one of the top. And sadly, it's no longer that case. Not as sad. And the reason why is because there was a lot of ideological wars, and it succeeded. Ironically, yeah, succeeded, and it's. I'm gonna get a little bit. I'm getting emotional just thinking about it and remembering how much I was surprised when I was doing my thesis. Um, it was interesting. I mean, when you see how wonderful the country was there. Okay, let's just talk about something as simple as education. When the educational system was first introduced into Egypt, there was two different types of education. There was the bourgeoisie education, which is the one for higher up, and the more money and wealth you had, the better education, which is, as history repeats itself, is currently what's going on in some parts of the world, which is why we see people traveling to like the US or like Japan or like Europe or US, Japan, Canada, countries outside of like the Middle East, in order to like get better education, except for like maybe Dubai, because pretty much Dubai did the opposite. They used their money to get the universities that are from outside to open branches inside of Dubai, so that like, and we're talking the elite universities. Last I've read, there was like couple of the big names were actually in Dubai. They had a branch in Dubai, and this is how they utilize the income and the revenue they got. The UAE, how it utilizes is income coming from like the different things, different economic things, and how they do that. While in Egypt, we failed to do that. And we failed to do that because the priorities got shifted. Now this is going to be on the longer end, and it's going to be longer and probably going to be we're probably going to have a little bit of different things, but education is extremely important, and we're going to go in and we're going to have different parts. So this is just the introduction to it, and we'll start next video with like the part 1 and part 2 and part 3.